A logo, TPTMN co-production. Representative Steny Hoyer, Democrat from Maryland, speaks on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. An ASL interpreter signs in the lower left corner of the screen.
They will henceforth, I think, look to this day and the day when the President of the United States signs this bill as the Independence Day for those who have been disabled.
Footage features a man with a white cane at a bus stop and a woman operating an industrial sewing machine.
But who have a willingness, a desire, and who are qualified and have an ability to participate in the promise of America.
Well, I have accomplished a lot.
Anna Hoganson stands beside a presentation on herself for the Cargill Learn program.
I would ask the members of this House on this historic day to say, now is the time to open the door of American life to all of the disabled.
A man drives a van with a custom steering wheel. In archival footage, demonstrators hold a sign that reads 504 equals civil rights. A woman signs to a crowd.
Today, tonight, do not delay this bill 1 minute more.
Words appear.
The ADA at 25, Disability Rights in Minnesota, is a Minnesota Partnership co-production of the Minnesota State Council on Disability, on the web at MSCOD25ADA.com and Twin Cities Public Television. This program is made possible by the state's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Black and white film reveals a man assembling in a factory.
Negative attitudes, stereotypes, discrimination. People can feel it when they go into a place.
A woman using a wheelchair rolls up to a voting booth.
MDIC says many disabled people can't even handle a paper ballot.
Society viewed you as a burden, as something that needed to be taken care of. You needed to be grateful for what you were given and not be too demanding.
It is too high for somebody in a wheelchair to be using.
Folks with disabilities have become acquiescent.
Black and white film and photos feature people using wheelchairs.
There are some good issues, but to try and get them to be those new advocates, people to carry the torch, it's harder to find them.
Photos show people in the workplace. Vintage film reveals a man at a drill press.
Will they get along with others? I mean my other employees.
Don't they need constant watching or supervision?
Good questions.
Brian Renfro interviews.
The thing is, they didn't really have labels back then. Like, they didn't have all the disability labels they have now. Like, you have ADHD, you didn't have Asperger's, you didn't have really bipolar schizophrenia. So you didn't have a lot to work with.
Old film shows a man working in a factory in a close-up of grinder sparks flying.
2 million employed, but another million could be employed and are not.
Raymond Luchek interviews using sign language.
I think that 50 years ago, there was no complete understanding about the use of sign language interpreting services. For example, in a courtroom or a doctor's office or another field, even a job interview.
Footage features a woman at a sewing machine. Now Sam Jasmine interviews.
That would have been really hard for me to live then. Disability was measured much more harsh.
A man uses a speech assistance device.
And this is kind of a subject that many people don't like to think about.
It was something to fear. You wouldn't have been as much in the public eye.
A TV call-in show, August 15th, 1989.
Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
I represent a group, I think, a large group of citizens who just object loudly and vigorously against the assault on our national purse, if you will, by the handicapped. For 6% of the population to enact an enormous tax on the basis that there's been some horrible deprivation of their rights and privileges is just simply a fraud on the national taxpayer.
Justin Dart.
Justin Dart, Jr., Presidential Committee on the Employment of People with Disabilities.
Well, I would say, with all due respect to the caller, that you've just heard a very good reason why we need this law.
A traffic light changes.
Wait.
Margot M.D. Cross interviews.
The Americans with Disabilities Act was one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities in our nation's history. It's a piece of legislation that provides civil rights protections in the area of employment, access to state and local government, access to public accommodations, which would be retailers, hotels, motels, nonprofits, telecommunications.
At a light rail station, a finger presses an audio button.
Selected service type is local service level.
Nate Allgard interviews.
This was our Civil Rights Act to provide equal access to society for us, people with disabilities.
Footage captures a dirt road winding through a rural area.
I was injured in a farming accident, and I grew up in a small town. I was the only person in a chair on the streets. So, of course, everybody looked and stared and thought, oh my God, what is she doing out? Why isn't she home? She's going to hurt herself.
Old photos show people using wheelchairs trying to cross non-accessible streets in neighborhoods.
I had grown up in a world that wasn't accessible, expecting restaurants not to have accessible restrooms, inaccessible entrances, no curb cuts. And if I wanted to get anywhere on the bus, it was this procedure where I would rump up the steps. I would literally, I was a lot more athletic back then, rump up the steps and then get some complete stranger to bring my chair aboard. And that's how I would get around on the public bus system. The whole world was different back then.
Former Senator Dave Durenberger interviews.
We're not all the same in our values in different parts of the country. But it's places like Minnesota, because of where people came from, because of what they brought with them in terms of social consciences, people tend to try to find better ways to solve problems that are faced by a small proportion of the entire population.
At a conference, people use wheelchairs. A sign reads services for special needs.
If we can't help those who have not the same advantages some of us have, then what good are we as a society? And that's a Minnesota value.
In a photo, a man uses a wheelchair at a meeting in an office. Durenberger gives a smirk.
All the Southern Democrats were more conservative than I was as a Northern Republican. It was a slow evolution.
In old film, people with disabilities work with nurses in a hospital.
It started when we deinstitutionalized our mental health hospitals, the 7 of them, 10,000 people, with a variety of disabilities.
A poster reads, "Disabled soldiers, sailors, Marines. Overcome your handicap. You can do it."
Returning World War II veteran didn't want to settle for a second-class citizenship. They wanted families, they wanted homes, they wanted the American dream, but they had a disability and they were experiencing a lot of discrimination. They started fighting back and they started organizing.
A black and white photo shows protesters on a sidewalk holding up signs and an American flag. Another features people using wheelchairs gathered around a row of candles.
In the mid to late 1940s, when we began the deinstitutionalization movement, that it became possible for a whole lot of people at the community level to recognize how many people were capable of independent living.
Up until 1990, a lot of other groups had gotten their civil rights, at least on paper, maybe not in reality, except for the disability community.
A photo reveals hands reading Braille on a page.
People could still build buildings with stairs, so somebody like me wouldn't be able to get in. Bathrooms too small. They didn't have to provide alternative communication like captioning or American Sign Language. So a lot of people were left out because they couldn't communicate with the rest of society.
In a vintage photo, 2 men stand next to a man using a wheelchair on a curb cut.
There are numerous people taking credit for curb cuts now, but up until that point, it was the alleys. That's how we got around. We scooted from alley to alley. We knew exactly where they were located, or we were in the street. Unfortunately, there are many, many people who actually were killed in traffic accidents because they were in the street.
In old film, people use wheelchairs on city streets.
Some of us ended up doing crazy stuff like learning how to back down staircases by holding onto the rail and holding onto your wheel.
At a rally, a crowd of people cheer as a man signs. A man in an iron lung holds a stick in his mouth, using it to press buttons on a device. My Tour interviews.
A lot of it took its origin within the throes of the civil rights movement. You know, people who feel that passionate about something that they are willing to take risks. It was more about families and parents and people advocating for a loved one. You know, in the 60s and 70s, you know, there was definitely, I think, more people just wanting to put themselves out there. How interesting it would be to have been involved in that, because that was history right there, you know. The people who were involved in that made history.
Justin Dart Jr.
There is massive misinformation. There are deep underlying assumptions that people with disabilities are not fully human.
At a protest, people using wheelchairs carry a banner that reads, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Martin Luther King Jr.
Justin Dart was wonderful. Justin Dart was a Republican. He became disabled, and he spent the last couple of decades of his life just trying to make things better.
And the principal thing that we hope this law will do will be to send a message to every citizen of America, including the caller, that we are equal, that disability is a normal condition of the human process, and that we are equal American citizens.
Logan Gherkin stands with construction workers in the snow-covered, partially completed St. Paul Saints CHS Field ballpark.
So we were somewhat of a non-traditional community process. The result of it is a much better, more well-defined community asset. It really is the municipal ballpark that everybody set out for it to be. One of the driving factors was accessibility, and making a ballpark that's as open and accessible, whether visually impaired, hearing impaired, or physically impaired, was very important to them. And I think it's pretty phenomenal.
Now, in the summer at the completed stadium, a crowd watches a game.
Generally, when a new building comes up, I can assume that I will be able to get in. The parking might not be done right, and that's a big issue, but...
Footage reveals a curb cut near accessible parking. Mark Hughes at the stadium.
I was on the Building Accessibility Committee with Margaret Cross and a whole bunch of other folks.
They were just welcomed the disability community with open arms and said, yes, let's make it as accessible as possible. This is the community's baseball team. Let's make sure the community can get to the ball games.
Accessible restrooms, accessible wheelchair slots.
Mark guides his wheelchair between two folding chairs and an open viewing balcony.
Are the counters accessible when you order? We've brought everything up to state-of-the-art. It's a win-win for everybody. There's revenue for St. Paul, people are employed, people are coming here having fun, it's revitalized Lower Town.
A Metro Mobility van parks outside the stadium.
Access is good business, and especially with the demographics of today, we have an increasing number of people with disabilities because we're getting older.
People using wheelchairs watch the game from the accessible viewing balcony.
Do you seriously want to discourage those people from spending money?
What I think has changed is technology. We didn't have the technologies back then. And who knows what the face of technology is going to look like 20 years from now.
In home video footage, Mark Felling opens the canopy of a single-engine plane and waves. He closes the canopy and takes off.
In 2003, I quite literally fell out of the sky on my head. I was flying my airplane. The engine died right after takeoff. I had to crash land it down in the Minnesota River Valley, and the whole airplane flipped over upside down, and I landed kerplop on my head and crushed my neck.
In his kitchen, he uses a motorized wheelchair and opens his refrigerator door.
My arms are essentially paralyzed from the elbows down, and so I just started researching and exploring what was available, what wasn't available, and after 3 months, cobbled together a voice-controlled cell phone system for myself, and I'd be tooling down the hallway, chatting on the phone, and of course people are saying, "Where'd you get that? I want one." And then the power grip.
A motorized metal pincer fits over his first 2 fingers and thumb. It tightens as he grips a soda can and takes a drink.
I guess finished that the last day I left rehab. So just the prospect of, how do I pick up a fork or a spoon or have a beer at the bar with my buddies. So this is the Voice IR voice control system. TV.
Yes, sir.
Power. Down 5.
He speaks into a device and his television activates.
And equally, I can use that to control my lighting, to raise and lower the head of the bed, open doors, you name it. We've now have 200 products and quite a few other options, buttons and joysticks and so forth that all go into that. So we make the broadest and only line of adaptive video game controllers worldwide.
He rolls up to a tray table-sized game controller with a large joystick and 2-inch buttons.
We also do computer accessibility to help put people back to work and school, head mice, and so forth. If I can give people the tools they need to do whatever it is they do best.
He raises a desk on a motorized lift and rolls into place under it before lowering it. Then he uses a custom mouse interface.
If you're a mom with a new baby, if you're a lawyer who needs to communicate constantly over a cell phone and has no use of their hands, if you're an artist, by empowering them to do whatever it is they do best, they will go out into the community, they will have impact, their family, local communities, their state, countries will be directly affected, and thus I can significantly amplify my impact on the world or the future world that I hope to see.
Former Senator Dave Durenberger interviews.
This was the beginning of the Great Society, and it was quite obvious that just segregating people with disabilities, the mentally ill are here, and the physically disabled are there, and that sort of thing, that wasn't the spirit that we felt was appropriate in Minnesota.
In black and white footage, a woman at an easel fits a paintbrush into a harness around her hand. She paints branching lines like leaves on a large pad of paper. John Schatzline interviews.
He was always open to listening. Senator Durenberger at that time was really aware of the need and was willing to support issues. But it was a grind.
Nate Allgard interviews.
People all over the country, all kinds of different groups came together and worked locally, worked nationally, educated, advocated. There were hearings held all over the country, thousands of pages of documentation.
I remember a job interview I was waiting for many, many years ago, long before the ADA. I was sitting in the waiting room with a bunch of other women. It was a clerical position. The guy conducting the interview came out and he looked at me and he said, "We don't hire your kind here, you can leave." And I was really quite shocked. It was like, was he talking to me?
In the early part of the 80s, I got involved with voting rights. And that's as simple as I can't get into the school to vote. So I can't vote. And that was happening all over America. You start with something that should be obvious to everybody. If you're stuck in a wheelchair, for your life, and you can't get the vote because the vote's in an inaccessible school, what kind of a country is this?
On Almanac, July 8, 1988, Mike Ehrlichman, Minnesota Council on Disability, sits on a panel with other guests.
The entire State Council on Disability has unanimously, and this is a statewide state agency, endorsed filing aggrieved party status, State Building Code Chapter 1340, which was passed 10 years ago. And we're still fighting the same battle. And I think the reason we're fighting the same battle is we have a building inspector in city of St. Paul who, when he's talking about the Gaultier Plaza, he says, "This isn't Courage Center. This is a public building."
Hi, this is Governor Rudy Perpich.
In a video, former Governor Perpich shakes Mike Ehrlichman's hand.
For years, I've been working together with people who have disabilities in an effort to provide greater access to buildings and to promote their human rights.
Before the ADA was ever signed into law, Governor Perpich, Mike Freeman, and Michael Ehrlichman got together and they decided that we got to make sure that Minnesota state government is accessible.
A protester holds a sign that reads LD and speech access means educational success.
They passed a bonding provision dedicated to the removal of barriers in state-owned and operated facilities.
What you needed to sell it was not in the Senate or the House so much as it was back home. Because back home, if you were a business that was going to have to change the way you did business in some fashion. If you were a city that had to start doing curb cuts, you could think right off the bat why we couldn't afford to do it.
You couldn't get into the private sector, and that's where business is. That's where the jobs are.
People in cubicles work at computers.
There was widespread fear, and employers were going, "Oh my God, now I'm just going to have to hire somebody who's handicapped? They can't do the job." Well, the fact is that many of us can do the job. They don't expect employers to hire people who can't do the job. They never did. You just cannot not hire us because we're disabled.
The biggest gap still is employment. And that is the key to so much. If you have money, you can go places. You can buy things. You can find a better place to live. If you don't, you're stuck. And that's where a lot of people with disabilities still are. They're stuck.
We are one of the best trained, most educated, protected classes in this country, and yet we have the highest unemployment rate. So it's not, can we do the job? It's, can we get the job?
In a warehouse, workers load and sort packages. Linda Hibbard interviews.
Epic Enterprise works with adults with disabilities. We're in Dundas, Minnesota. We're serving about 115 people. Somebody comes in and is looking for a job. During that time period where we're getting to know a person, we go through a process kind of researching who they are, what their skills are, and then start exploring places where those things might be of value for an employer.
Kelly Milland wears overalls and tills a garden row.
I found it through Epic. They did a couple job search looking that I would like to do, but none of them sounded as good as this one.
Virginia Ketchmarek interviews.
Erin came in to work with our open gym program for preschoolers. And if you've seen Erin's smile, she lit up the day that she first started volunteering in that program.
Erin O'Donnell interviews.
I do wiggles and giggles, and I set up the toys and play with the kids.
Dorothy Sherrill prepares and labels packages for shipping.
This was my first year of doing this, but I'd done catalogs and stuff.
Dot is a hard worker. She has a lot of enthusiasm. This has been a good fit for her as well, for her to be at Farmer Seed and Nursery.
Dylan Krensky works in a greenhouse, bagging plants.
We go and look for places of employment, and then they help me fill out my job application and stuff, and then I hope for a job.
Terry Hartman interviews.
Dylan's a great guy. He works really hard, works really well, gets along really well with everybody. You put stuff in front of him and the greenhouse can't keep up with him. The only thing he can't do is see.
A lot of people with disabilities tend to be probably more loyal, more reliable. They're going to stick with the job longer because they have had to fight so hard to get it in the first place.
Anna Hoganson gives a presentation on herself for the Cargill Learn program.
I am more attentive to detail, and I have accomplished being more aware of people in my surroundings.
Colleen Hagar goes over Jason Bogus's presentation with him. Now she interviews.
We're at Cargill in Hopkins. Our classroom is downstairs. Students come there every day. The program's called Transition Plus, and it's a program for young adults with disabilities, 18 to 21. And we focus on supporting them really to establish independence through work, job skill development, and post-school training.
In a kitchen, Keenan Myers chops vegetables. Mark Olmstead interviews wearing a chef's uniform.
I coach him, I mentor him every day, how to do certain things in the kitchen, and he's a natural. Well, myself, I have ADHD, so I get it. And so when I work with him, I can relate that real easy with him. You know, how to stay organized, how to stay focused, how to coach him and get him from point A to point B.
You know, the bar is up here, and
She lifts her hand above her head.
they don't hesitate to jump and to meet that bar. They're not really sure what's going to happen. They're not sure if they're going to like it or not like it, and then they find out pretty quickly, wow, this is cool. I'm a part of something really big.
We can't afford to have people sitting around doing nothing. And by and large, that's not what they want to do. They want to be productive. They want to be part of things. They want to offer up their talents to society just like anybody else.
I would encourage employers to really open up their eyes to possibilities. Seeing the smile on Kelly's face today as she talked about her job, whether it be Kelly or Erin or Dot or Dylan, it doesn't matter. But as they have success in their job, that's what makes it worth it.
July 13th, 1990, Tom Harkin signs on the Senate floor.
The guy across the table from me, the Democrat, was Tom Harkin from Iowa. And Tom had a brother who was deaf. So Tom could sign to all of us.
The winning message was to find lawmakers with relatives who had disabilities.
And they would go to bat for you, and it depended on their seniority and who their cronies were and what would they trade for that vote. That's the game. It's still the game.
the word would get around. Sternberger's on the committee, Sternberger's writing the bill, stuff like that. There are thousands of one-on-ones or the right 5 people in a room or the right 20 people in the room.
And one way to get the bill passed was to develop a grassroots movement. Here's a project for you, Margot. Why don't you see if you can help out here? Yeah, I was real naive. It was like, you want me to do what? I had to contact a lot of folks to say, will you support this?
A woman at a protest carries a sign that reads human rights.
And there was a lot of pushback. There were a lot of people who said, I'm a charitable organization. I don't want to upset our contributors. We want people to feel comfortable giving us their money. I don't think I can write a letter of support. Oh no, you can. You can write that letter.
We went down and had a meeting with the congressman from northwestern Minnesota, and he was not on board. And to his credit, he showed up. There was a packed room, and everybody was clamoring for him to switch his mind and his vote, and eventually he did vote for it. And to me, that was a really big deal, that we came together as advocates, told our representative what we wanted him to do, and he listened.
It's not such a big deal as you think it is to make those changes. You build them in now, cost you a little bit of money to do it, but over the long term, you're going to have many more people going to be your customers.
25 years later, they probably have a disability, an age-related one, and it's kind of like, I hope you're benefiting from some of the accessibility that you were initially opposed to.
It was an inevitability, and there was never much discussion about, can't we put this off until we get a Democratic president, by the Democrats. And President Bush said, I'll be happy to have this on my watch.
A photo of an outdoor ceremony on the south lawn of the White House shows George H.W. Bush signing the act.
And I think he said as much at the signing. There was more emotion in this than anything else. And it was repeated all the time, not just at a signing or when somebody reminds me of it, but every time.
The White House wanted a very small, cordial, in the Rose Garden. It was like, no, we want a huge celebration.
On the south lawn, a podium sits on a stage with a large crowd gathering to watch.
See all the members of Congress there, people you only see on TV. It was pretty cool.
So all of a sudden you hear the drum roll and out comes President Bush. As soon as you start hearing that, everybody jumps up, except the people who can't jump up. And from them you hear a chorus of a couple thousand people saying, down in front.
We immediately put our civil rights into action.
A man using a wheelchair rolls under a rope barrier into the audience.
So the deaf people could see the interpreters, so we could see the speakers.
That to me was the ADA.
So people just sat down and so everybody could see, who was able to see.
Former President Bush stands at a podium.
This is an immensely important day, a day that belongs to all of you. And everywhere I look, I see people who have dedicated themselves to making sure that this day would come to pass. And then the organizations. So many dedicated organizations for people with disabilities who gave their time and their strength. And perhaps most of all, everyone out there and others across the breadth of this nation, our 43 million Americans with disabilities. You have made this happen. All of you have made this happen.
George H.W. Bush is not known as a great public speaker, but I tell you what, if I listen to that thing, I'd choke up. I really do, because I know exactly what it felt like to be there and listen to that for the first time.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And these words have been our guide for more than 2 centuries as we've labored to form our more perfect union. And now I sign legislation which takes a sledgehammer to another wall, one which has...
In the crowd, people using wheelchairs clap and wave flags.
One which has, for too many generations, separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse, but not grasp. And once again, we rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America. I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disability Act and say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
Mark Hughes sits in the St. Paul Saints Stadium watching a ball game from a wheelchair-accessible viewing balcony.
Yeah, all right. That's great.
Don't take a look at me because of, the apparatus around me. Take a look at me for the individual I am. Take a look at me for the individual you are. We're people accomplishing these same goals, working toward a goal. And don't look at me because I'm in a wheelchair. Look at me for the individual that I might be.
Credits roll. Producer, offline editor Steve Spencer. Managing producer Pamela M. Palin. Associate producer, offline editor Alana Used. Production assistant, offline editor Ariel Tilson. Videographers Michael Phillips and Jim Crone. Field audio Terry Gray and Eric Pagel. Graphic design John Van Amber. Editor Valerie Mondor. Audio sweetening Mitch Griffin.
Thank you.
Copyright 2015, Minnesota State Council on Disability and Twin Cities Public Television.
The ADA at 25, Disability Rights in Minnesota, is a Minnesota Partnership co-production of the Minnesota State Council on Disability, on the web at MSCOD25ADA.com and Twin Cities Public Television. This program is made possible by the state's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Video description by Caption Max. A logo, TPTMN co-production.